Hey, Darin. Thanks for
Hi.
joining us.
But of course.
Hey, John.
Howdy. Hey, Darin, how's it going?
It's going well. How are you? It's been a while.
It has. I decided to go outside today, out of my cave.
Oh, it's nice. It's beautiful out. It's not too hot yet.
I don't know. Yesterday I did like 11 hours straight without seeing sunlight, so I was like, today I'm gonna come out.
I had a day like that yesterday too. It was a Zoomorama. It was really a zoomy day.
Hey, Rad. Hey, Jax. Herwig.
So I think we're waiting for Angelica and Lucy, and then I think we can probably just get going.
Okay, I'll be right back.
Hi, Lucy.
Hi.
Hey, Angelica.
Hi.
All right.
Hey, Lucy. Hey, Angelica.
Hi. Hi, John. How's it going?
How's it going? Good.
Good, thank you.
I think this is all of us. So let's go ahead and just get started. Thank you. So we have our guest critics are Darin Johnstone, Lucy McRae, and Herwig. And I think you guys probably all know everybody, so I don't think I can say some introductions.
Hello, everybody.
So let's go ahead and get going. Wenzhi, are you ready to go?
Yes.
Cool. I'm share screen.
Share my screen. Everyone can see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jax, and my project title is Habitat 2020. And first of all, a module is an essential part of architectural discourse, bound together with concepts like prefabrication and mass production. So if we take different modules and components and put them together and combine the mass production and customization, then ask the question, can the module being constructed beyond the scale limit? Does the concept of module still exist? Is it possible to rethink the space and material and form limits of repetitive modular architecture? So this project stands as the counterpoint to the repetitive nature of modern modular architecture. Instead, it proposes an alternative kind of prefabricated architecture that allows for multiple differentiation and avoids simple Cartesian repetition, just like the habitat on the right side. The site chosen is right next to the 67, the habitat 67, as the proposal aims to be a contrast to that iconic project. It is also a residential project. So in Habitat 67, the units, material, and interior spaces and forms are limited by single material of concrete. When it comes to the 2020, the forms are no longer limited. All the components are joined in different ways. Every single units have different interior spaces. The building expands across the bridge. highway bridge, and sometimes it will expand out to the river. And in between the units, it forms several different dynamic public spaces, gardens, and outdoor areas. For midterm, I developed a portion of the project into detail to see the possible material circulation and interior space. This is the axon of it. And this is the south end of the building. And the island point right to the north. This is the portion of it. And this is the man point perspective from the riverside. So as you can see in the diagram, the units are all resulted into different combination of interior spaces. And nearly every single unit has their own access to the ground. And they're all, the egress stairs are not technically limited in the cores. And when I think about the structural part, the shell-shaped parts are made out of steel structural skeleton, clad in fiberglass and GFRC panels. And this is a plan of it. And in the end, I tested several different combinations of colors and textures. The texture of the project spanned the seams of the components which camouflage and disguise the reading of the parts. So basically, I took a lot of parts from, I choose a lot of parts from different fields, either it's toy parts or architectural parts, and trying to combine them and cut them, rejoin them. So when I joined them, in order to not see the parts, so I use the texture to cover the seams, expand across the seams, so it doesn't look like there are, it will look like the whole thing. And these are the several different textures I tested. And after midterm, I will keep developing the rest part of the project. And then I'll develop several chunks into structural details, so to show how this thing will be constructed. And that's pretty much what I have for midterm right now.
Hey, Jax. You said nearly every unit has their own access to the ground. Which units don't? And what are the conditions around those units that do not have their own access to the ground?
Some units, they may share the egress stairs, like here. Because the shape I have sometimes is limited. So some units, they may share the access, like the egress access, but the elevator cores are the center or shifted outside. What I imagine is the shell structure can hold themselves, and the elevator cores and egress can be shifted around in the building. So because of the complexity of the project.
So not every unit has access to the to an elevator core, but instead there'd be, let's say, a limited number connected to an elevator core, and then you'd have to connect through egress stairs going from unit to unit, or am I reading that wrong?
From the elevator is direct access, but the egress, sometimes you have to go around the building, go around other units.
You said at the beginning that the difference to the precedents is that you're no longer bound to a single material, right? Like you could have any kind of material. And
yeah,
the second thing you said was that there's a certain freedom in shape. So every unit can be individual, basically. Larger, smaller, different material, which would suggest that there's a certain kind of like mentality of customization of the individual units, like that you could order online and customize your habitats of sorts, right? Like what material you want, what color, how big you want it, etc., within a certain framework. And I think that's a really interesting concept, because I think it's also a very contemporary concept of how being able to fit into some sort of a manufacturing process and being able to change things in terms for housing. The other thing I think that's interesting is the kind of accessibility to exterior space, which you're showing in some areas, I guess, with these pools, and like there's some little green patches in there. I'm just wondering if all three of these elements, I think, are really appealing, and it's a really interesting thing. I'm just wondering if you, in a way, if you look at the massing, it looks very compact still. And I'm just wondering how this kind of geometry would lead itself to being able to be more spongy, or like more flexible in terms of like, how can it expand? Can you push in void spaces for larger outdoor spaces if you want that? And in terms of the materials, is there some sort of you're basically showing us different patterns that are pretty uniform, and you're talking about unifying the whole thing, which kind of goes a little bit counter to what you said before, that there is a certain individualism in terms of material choices, etc. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on those things, but also maybe they need to require a little bit more thought in terms of like how this could be. I mean, I understand you don't want to have a hodgepodge of stuff that you just jumble together, but I think maybe if you can define some sort of a framework of, it can be from this to this size, it can be from this to that material. So you have some choices, like, you order Nike shoes, you can customize those, but it's not free for all. There's a certain kind of like palette of things you can pick. And that would make sense with your different kind of like pattern choices that you have. But what would be interesting to see how the combination of those two could actually change the appearance, rather than trying to have one homogeneous kind of like look to it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It sort of, it raises a lot of questions. I agree with the Herwig on the strengths of the project. There's a question about what the rules of prefabrication for your project in particular are. I think for me, the thing that I wonder about the most in terms of where you're at the moment is that you've created a high level of, let's say, distinction or character within the unit. Interestingly enough, in the zoom out, the aggregation of the system is very similar to Habitat 67. And so if I understand that there are differences, certainly, but in the end, it is a kind of horizontal, accreted mass. And I wonder, given the distinction of the units, if there are other massings that you might explore. I mean, perhaps there's a kind of a compare and contrast that you're going for here. But I guess when we've worked on this problem in 3A, and one of the projects that we look at a lot is Walden 7 by Ricardo Bofill, because it kind of strikes this sort of interesting middle territory where it's not purely kind of unitized into a single monolith, but it's also not just a simple result of a bottom-up kind of organization. So I guess I wonder a lot about the massing of the project and the rules of prefabrication.
Thank you.
Jax, I wonder if, so you spent a lot of time thinking about the unit and the variations of those units. I wonder if you can begin to spend a little bit more time thinking about, let's say, the processions that you go through to get to, let's say, a unit that's kind of far off, as opposed to just being a straight shot elevator ride to a unit and drop you off, right? And so the way that you're imagining these units, if the elevator just takes you directly to the interior, then you're only really kind of understanding the project in two terms, either from completely removed from the outside on the street and kind of stepped away. And even then, it's like there's not really a lot of space around the building for travel. And so what, kind of questioning, what happens once you get out of the elevator and how you move through that space. But then also, if you're taking an elevator directly into the unit, then you're only in the interior and you're not really considering, let's say, how you begin to catalog and organize the various types of spaces around and outside that are kind of generated from the grouping and clustering of these various units. And so I think it'll be helpful to just kind of like map out a small handful of various processions. Right, you go under a large mass and then through an open volume and then down a narrow hallway.
I really like this view. It feels hand-drawn. There's like an element of sketchiness to it that feels unfixed. And I guess one of my questions, and it relates to the first slide that you showed, is like, what is the premise? If this was a movie, what's the premise of your movie? What's the question that you are deeply concerned with, or that's, agitating this project? And then fast forward to 5 years, 10 years, 5 months time, what do you want to be doing after SCI-Arc? And how can this project steer the work that will come after this? And maybe that probably came in your kind of question before thesis and the things that have really been motivating you. And then my other thought is from a body scale, it's very sculptural. If you were to take a piece of this, you could put it in a gallery as a form in and of itself. Would it be that these habitats would mostly resonate towards a dancer or somebody who's very much in their body, because the spaces are very kind of fluid and round and bodily? And how does that then change the mindset of waking up in a room of the neighbor, of the very sort of, as we know it, living space, compared to the mindset of waking up in a space that you've created? Because I think now, living in this pandemic, we are all deeply reevaluating how we are in this world. Nobody knows what's coming next. And could it be that the shapes of which we live in somehow build upon our resilience as a human brain, a human mind, a human heart? And could you look at the kind of mass scale at the end of this island, but then look at the effect that this new form would have on an individual? And does that even matter to you?
Yeah. So to think more from a person's perspective.
Yeah, like what,
from man's perspective.
Yeah, what would it be like? Like I'm pointing at the second space that's next to the tennis court. It's kind of like this, the end of the colon, let's say. What is it like to live in that space and be in that space constantly as we are now? And how does that affect me? Like if I'm a kid growing up, would that mean that I'm going to become and evolve into a different being because I've lived in a space that is of this shape within this neighborhood, as opposed to my neighbor that has come, so could it be that, this is a very long bow, that you are able to dynamically inform I don't think it's biology, but and it probably, maybe it is physiology, but to really inform the human of living in this space and what they become,
Yeah.
Because what we are becoming is really under the microscope right now.
Okay.
And
So I just
maybe that doesn't matter to you. Maybe
Yeah.
it is about the first page of your thesis. But what I'm interested in, like probably everyone, is like, what am I going to be doing in 6 months' time? What am I going to be doing in 6 years' time? Because everybody at the moment is a speculative designer. We're all trying to work out what's next.
That's interesting. Lucy, I think your comments are really fantastic for Jax, and on all the reviewers. And I know we have to wrap up to keep on time, but I just wanted to maybe cap it off in a way from Herwig's really good observation about the patterning and the monotony of the pattern. I think it's a really kind of something we've talked a lot about. I think the intent is to disguise the individual piece. So, but it isn't an attempt to be homogeneous, and that leads to Darin's comment about, is it too similar to Habitat 67? Although I would say it's okay to just be a strain of that body of work, and it doesn't have to be so different. It's okay that he admits it, and it's like, it's a focus. And then to Matthew's points about circulation and exterior space, and does it equate to a similar variety of exterior space? And then finally, to Lucy, I think it's super interesting what you're talking about. And I think, Jax, it's a challenge to you to put that in the mindset. I think it happens often with everyone's work, and certainly in thesis, when we get into the project, it's so long, the work on it's so long, right? Like 15 weeks. And then it's just working it. And it can get kind of dry. And I think Lucy's bringing it back to a higher level of what's this for, and an excitement of possibilities of what the kind of payoff of all this kind of work could be. And I like how you're turning it into, I mean, the focus on our homes and where we live this last 6 months has been really intense, like where we live and work, I would say, right? Like, and it's either brought a renewed focus, meaning those places have to get way better, or it's certainly even called into the question of what's a workspace to begin with, and is it even needed? So I think the question of maybe getting inside to one of these units or a few of them, and really seeing like, I mean, how would it change how you live, to live in something that's kind of part duck plaything and, you know, some other kind of object in the end. Anyway, thanks for all those comments. They were really great.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'll stop sharing.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Jax. Let's see here. We got Bowen and Yixin. Are you guys ready?
Yes. Yeah. Hi, I'm Yixin. I'm Bowen. Our project is building a city as building. This project is an exploration into how city can develop in the future and is attempting to provide new, diversified, and dynamic future models for vertical urban development and public spaces. Based on the fact that our cities are growing rapidly and becoming saturated, our project explores the potential of a new relationship between the building and the city. Using New York City as a site is an optimal place for this proposition with its dense existing context. The exploration of this relationship in our project is to create a large vertical site of buildings to contain all of the elements of a typical city. Tall buildings increase available living and working space, thereby reducing the intensity of density in some areas. In this vertical city, people live, work, go to school, and socialize as they do in horizontal cities, but in different manners having to do vertically. The project hopes to provide a platform for promoting the coexistence of multiple lifestyles, programs, spaces, and activities that have new relationship in a vertical skyscraper. In this project, In this project, the grid acts as a transportation system constructed by the city, similar to the public subway system, yet containing vertical and horizontal systems which contain people and vehicle circulation. The massing and the individual buildings are thought of as being developed by separate developers accommodating the various program types. Each massing will be like a street building in a horizontal city with the same scale, same height, and same function. We extract from the existing New York buildings facade and change it into the facade of our massing, which are combined with a simple color to distinguish different programs.
The three-dimensional grids. Sorry. And the three-dimensional grids creates a matrix for the building masses. A large connected to public space, runs vertically through the project. Major civic programs such as museum, libraries, hospital, theaters are distributed compositionally throughout the vertical city. Housing and office programs fill in the back of all other programs. The entrance at the street level is connected to Grand Central Terminal, a major entrance point to the city, and a large public plaza is situated between the Grand Central Terminal and Hamsley Building.
Yeah, that's it.
I think it's a really interesting project. I think what's I guess I have a question about the are these cuts that you have in that yes, it looks like you're slicing through masses, etc. Are they representational, or are they actually, or is that a real thing? You know, like if you zoom into that bottom right hand thing, for example, it looks like you're cutting through a building. And it's I think it's really fascinating that that's an open space. I'm just wondering if is that actually the intent, or is it, or you're?
No, it's just a section perspective drawing.
Maybe that's maybe this is something you can take and go with. I mean, even if it's a representational thing, I mean, I think it's if I imagine this thing becoming all enclosed volumes, it's a lot less interesting because
no, I think it's open, right? Can you zoom in on your not a section view, but like you got to zoom in on this thing. Yeah, keep zooming. Go get them inside. Yep.
Yeah.
Zoom closer.
I mean,
closer.
There's a lot of open space. I mean, I think there's a great opportunity there to kind of deal with this kind of like slicing and partial slicing and cutting, and then parts are again solid, and you know, this kind of like grid and circulation kind of system that you have running through it. It's really like, it looks like some sort of a starship that got ripped open, you know, and you can see all the guts inside of it. And so I think it's I also think the coloring and color coding of different elements is something that has huge potential, and I would maybe develop that a lot further to kind of, currently it looks like it's mostly a single color, but rather than just IDing thing, that's maybe how to highlight interiors or public spaces, etc. And maybe there's a way of how to produce some sort of legibility of public spaces and how they're connected, and maybe talk a little bit also about these kind of vertical public spaces, what their advantages are. You know, this kind of like three-dimensional public spaces that you can walk up onto or climb up onto, and not just be on a flat surface. I think that's a super interesting concept, and it seems like there's a lot of these spaces might be connected actually, and to maybe highlight some of these connections. So if I move through this kind of city, there's places I can go freely, and the places probably I need a key or something to get in. So to be able to, and it's a little hard to read right now where is what exactly, and maybe part of that is the intention. But I think to maybe show this, because I think that is the interesting thing about this, that this is a sectional city, right? Where it can move diagonally through space, and I think that's I would really work on that as a kind of quality that you're promoting, and a very different type of public space than the one we are moving on. That's all on flat surfaces, essentially surrounded by buildings. Yours is cutting across multiple volumes up through it, and there might also be some shortcuts, etc., how you get from one space to the other, etc., etc. So I would really think about that spatially, design-wise, and maybe that's where the colors come in, and maybe also some sort of idea of how you program something like this, how you deal with media and something like that, media no longer on the building, but media in terms of like on the surfaces, on these public surfaces themselves, and maybe that's a way how to do them, etc. It's really nice.
Is this a fixed design, like, or are you designing, let's say, an infrastructure that's parallel to the grid of New York, and so that there would be empty and available lots that could get developed later on? Let's say John and Margaret win the competition for MoMA vertical, and so now they have a spot that they have to design their vertical inside of. Is that something that you imagine in this project, so that any of the things that you're showing are maybe stand-ins for a future development of something that could take on a different life than what you're actually proposing, or what you're showing us initially, and that it could change? That's what you're. So maybe, and this might go along with some of the sort of idea of a sectional city or anything else, but maybe part of what you would do is write the zoning code for your city, right? What are the regulations and what are the limits about development? Like, how far can you extrude out? What are limitations about visibility and access? Things like that. All of the things that you would normally find when you're developing a project, or when you're doing a project in a city, that limit the shape and size and character of these things.
Thank you.
Well, I love your project. I mean, it's there's a series of things that we've been working on, and things that John and I have worked on together as well in 2GB. Notions of both of verticality and also the idea of a building, which is sort of neither city nor building, or is both city and building by virtue of its scale. And the idea of a kind of flip up of the fabric, I think, is incredibly powerful. I think there are a lot of really strong things that are happening, and the premise I find really compelling. I think Herwig's comments are very, very interesting. I was looking at the kind of like on the side, on the other monitor, monitor 1, 2, 3. On the monitor 3, I was looking at the hyper building by OMA, which is kind of one of these sort of city scaled premises. And a couple things that happen, the idea of mediated surfaces, obviously, but the diagonal becomes this really important aspect of the kind of circulation system. So I think it seems like you have this super grid, which allows for vertical and horizontal circulation, which is, it seems, strong as a kind of premise. But I wonder, there's one diagonal I can see, but the idea of kind of cross-circuiting or kind of Market Streeting, like Market Street in San Francisco, that cuts through on the diagonal and sort of gets all the aspects of the city. So that, I think, is very interesting. I wonder, like, the quality of this is not a critique, it's a question. Like, I wonder how specific the individual buildings need to be, or conversely, how generic they can be. Like, they each seem to have, a certain amount of character in and of themselves. And so I wonder, I just wonder about that, how much of it would be generic if you think about it in the role of, in relationship to the city proper. But perhaps it's interesting because even the generic becomes is kind of alienating when you see it like locked in this giant grid and floating in the sky. So it's an interesting project.
Yeah, thank you.
The first thing I've written here is edge of the brain. I was asked maybe 10 years ago where I thought the edge of my brain was, and I had to answer within 30 seconds. And at that point, it was a very naive answer to as far as I had traveled, you know, within the world. And my reason for saying that is that I would assume you're traveling less because there is more vertically. So does that allow for more or less serendipitous encounters because you are living perhaps within a more refined program? Does that mean that that chance is reduced because things are closer? I've got a hospital, a library, a theatre, a retail, and my home within this much space as opposed to that much space. It's just like the kind of sensation of what that could bring about. Again, I feel like this is sort of subconsciously you've tapped into the pandemic and our kind of sense of limitations of. So it's a very interesting project, again, for many, many reasons. It made me think about vertigo, just the meaning and what that means in terms of like the title of your project. And then a very unrealistic concept that isn't possible, but sort of inspired by seeing the sections through, is that if I understand correctly, you've kind of taken what is this and done that. And so how would you do that on a scale of a swimming pool? And is that, you know, would that be possible that somehow this beautiful like kidney shaped section up the top, somehow because you have flipped everything and you're presenting a very different way of living, could you present some kind of without gravity or gravity being rotated concepts to bring about this sensation of vertigo or the vertical?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you guys really hit it on the head on a lot of things with their project. I think Matthew, particularly the zoning envelope, you know, which always comes up, I think, with all cities and city kind of planning, right? I think they're open to that idea of, you know, a kind of rule set at least at the massing scale. Like I think that comes up a lot when this project's discussed, which is how do they go about making decisions. I think the use of public space to organize the city is just as valid in this one, and Herwig's points of the use of the diagonal, and Darin also mentioned. I think it's literally Broadway, only vertically through this part of the building, and they do need to be linked more, I think, literally, so that we understand there's a kind of path. I mean, it would be a wonderful thing to be able to go to the top of this and walk down, you know? I mean, you think of Manhattan walking from Central Park to Wall Street and making a day of it, that this could operate at that level. And I think you're developing a real richness, as has been said, to the kind of quality of these spaces. Just for the jurors, so they know that they went through a process of mapping the generic stuff, which is housing and office space, with texture maps of the city, just literally mapping them. And then it was important to get the right scale, because this project from afar always looks like a structural grid, but really, as you now know, those are elevators and stairs and horizontal, electric cart tubes. But then they got rid of all that, but they used it to actually model all the facades. So then they use that texture map. That's why there's a variety of scaled opening and things like that. And I'm not sure if it's better like this modeled, or whether the old texture mapping was actually more successful, because it made a difference between the generic, which in their world is the housing and office, which is what cities are mostly made of, and then the special pieces, civic, libraries, hospitals, museums, other things. So I think they're struggling with that. And also, as Herwig mentioned, the color of it, and is it diagrammatic like it is now, or does it get kind of super saturated? At one point it was really colorful and it was looking like kind of, there was a Coney Island aesthetic. I remember like there's a Ferris wheel in this. Can you zoom in, you guys? I'm sorry, my eyes are so bad, but there's so much detail. Can you zoom into the Ferris wheel?
Yeah.
Wherever, yeah, keep going. I mean, they have people in this thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I think there are still some decisions to be made for them on like how it's finally presented, like a kind of architectural zoning vagueness, like this might be, or a kind of hyper realistic, like here it is in all its like, you know, multi-material aspects of a city. And I don't have the answer for that, but they have something to work on the next 6 weeks, 4 weeks.
All right, thank you. So, Lourenco, ready?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me properly?
Yep,
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Great. Let me share my screen. So I'm going to put on the chat a link. It's a website that has the presentation, but I'm going to screen share it and you can follow along with my screen share if you wish to. So let's share that. And hope you can see my website right now. Yeah. Okay. All right. So this thesis is essentially trying to define an idea of architectural blankness. It looks at architecture as something that is meant to do nothing except to simply be there, still and quiet, and maybe sometimes even looking a bit dumb to only wake up when needed. So essentially it's fusion into background and activation into foreground when required. An example of that would actually be the stairs, which is number 3. So this is an idea of where it's a simple room, it's a boxy room, but when it's required, the architecture itself pops out of the box and comes into the foreground and is activated. And then when it is no longer needed, it reverts back to its old self, to simplicity. So we can essentially add a lot of things to architecture to do for social reasons, symbolic reasons. There's a lot of things that architecture supposedly can do, but this thesis looks at it in more in a sense of identity of background and foreground, and that's where it should remain. So we're looking at essentially formally reductive transformation, or simply a simple geometry. I did some massing studies. There's a lot of them, and they all kind of consistent to a certain point. But it also looks at the idea of killing the components and having object continuity. So having an idea of a consistent object throughout. This is a small chair that usually is designed through multiple pieces and screws and all of these things. So they're all stripped away and we just end up with pure form. And so this project has been moving along through these ideas of blankness and layering and object continuity. And so right now I'm at a point of what does a blank building look like, right? So far, the building kind of manifests itself from afar as a singular and simple mass, much like a neutral canvas, and the layers within the mass represent an alternative to the part or the component. So this produces differentiation without fragmentation, and so the layers are continuous and not discretized. So as an example, for example, would be a rock who is layered and remains internally self-consistent, even if cut, extracted, or excavated. And so the architectural paraphernalia of lights, doors, windows, and technical objects are considered enemies of blank space, for they represent the module and the mass-produced components. and they bring unnecessary complexity. So the project is now in the development of a singular piece of architecture that has absent within, for now, a specific program and is essentially just public space. There's a few more things in the website that you can explore, but for now, that's it. Thank you for listening.
I think I have a comment on the word that you're using pretty often, that is simple, associated with the being blank, in a way that exactly like looking at the stair. The stair itself, it's really not simple. It's actually very, very complex if you look at it. But something that I really kind of connect with the idea of like blankness is something that your architecture looks very bodily in a way. It's very fluid, and it's lacking in a very good way of like any symbolism. It seems like very democratic in a way. It seems like it's an architecture that could represent anyone that enters the building, but not in a simple way. I wouldn't be afraid of like combining the word like complexity with the word blank, because I don't think they are like opposed. I think they can totally go together, and still you can keep the concept pretty strong.
I also think, you know, if you're you're trying to define blank exactly, it's blank at the moment because also because it has no materiality, or it's a computer massing shaded model, which to some degree always is going to be blank because it has very little definition. But I think what's interesting is if you're interested in this kind of like tension between background and foreground, and when something comes to detail and when it disappears into a background, I think the question is, are you looking at this in this kind of like shaded mode, or are you gonna look at this in terms of like a hyperreal mode, right? So if you're looking at a monolithic shape like a pyramid, right, that has a lot of texture actually, the closer you get, right? And so there's kind of like different granulates of things. So it's erasing openings, yes, but it's adding kind of material erosion, other things to it. So I guess my question is, what kind of a volume will that eventually be? I mean, it makes a big difference because I think, for example, let's just say this is like some sort of a glass box that will have like patterns and lines on it, and joints and things like this, which will make it much less neutral but much more specific. So I mean, I just want to hear from you what your stance on that is and how you see that project developing.
So I think I might end up, I mean, that idea of, for example, the glass having lines and structure and all of that. So the idea is to develop to that point of tectonics, because it will make the challenge of actually producing something that's complex be blank. But I think the thing here would be to actually try and I mean, maybe hide, or maybe hide is not the right word, but maybe not show off the detail as much as when we look at a morphosis building where the technical part of the building is really showcased and promoted. Here it would be kind of the opposite. So even if I add, panelize the glass and have structure and work it out, I think the challenge is still to try and the final result be something as similar as possible as to what I'm showing you, which doesn't have seams and structure and complexity in a technical term.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume, see, for example, a different use of material like for example, rather than if this is glass and you use the glass really rather than as a surface, as a fin, or like as a texture, and you can produce again a monolithic kind of like object that has a very different reading to it than just trying to resolve it into a kind of, I mean, I think I guess what I'm saying is like there needs to be, you could turn material on its head. It was this project, and I think in my opinion, it would need an angle like this where you can say, I'm going to use a certain material in a way that it has never been used before that produces this kind of effect. And it's unexpected what you would usually assume this would be. So kind of going against kind of any kind of norm of tectonics and start trying to use materials in a very different kind of way.
Thank you. Yeah,
it's challenging for me to understand your definition of the word blank. That's why I just pasted in that quote from 70s rock icon Richard Hell regarding the idea of the blank generation and his kind of definition of the word blank. Like, and so I have my own kind of version of that, or what that might mean, and perhaps that's the stumbling block a bit for me. But I guess it's hard for me to evaluate what you're working on in an acontextual way. When I think about blankness, or artists like Robert Irwin, who are working on the kind of the ephemeral and the atectonic within the realms of space, like the context is so important. So is it like that? Are you erasing something? Are you showing something? Like, I think if it's blankness unto itself, I think it's hard for me to evaluate, I guess, is what I would say.
Is something still blank when it's colored, in your opinion?
Yes, I would say so. As long as it is continuous on its surface.
So solid.
To a certain extent, yes.
And what if this material was porous and you dropped it in a bucket of coffee and it absorbed at a different rate because of the sensitivity of the material and it gave you a gradient? Is that still blank?
I would say yes, because it would still continue to act as a singular object. Or even if it has even if it has things around it and inside of it, because it is layered, it is still self-consistent to itself. So you can have multiple textures. So each layer could have a different texture, which is kind of what's happening here with the glass and then the white mass. This is just a simplistic way of showing it.
And sorry for the kind of dumb questions, but is something still blank if this shape that you have here is placed within the mess of a city? Would it be less blank or more blank? Because we're looking at everything on a blank background. So as a visual, it's it's, I guess, easier to take in what you're saying. And then it makes me think that, about sacred space, places of worship, that you wake up when needed, killing components, enemies of the blank. I think that your words are really interesting, and could that inform the program of what this thing would be as a blank space?
Yeah, I think so. I've actually been looking at Japanese temples and old churches, just mainly for the way they work with light and the succession of spaces, one after the other. For the background part, I think you're right. So this building does have a site. I'm just not presenting it. It's in Osaka for the 2025 World Expo, and it is a very congested, complex urban skyscraper with a lot of stuff going on, with a museum next to it that is insane. So I think once it's actually put into context, it will become even more blank due to its contrast with the context.
Yeah. It also makes me think about the echo of the blank. Like, what would that be? And the echo between your blank space and the building next to it, but then the echo of which when you are inside the blank as a sound design.
I'm wondering if maybe the premise, and this is okay that it's like this, but the premise is one that's kind of set up to fail. In that, you know, and I think this is kind of the lessons that we've learned from the legacy of minimalism and conceptual art in the 60s and 70s. If you look at people like Kantake or others, where as soon as you start to strip away or remove things, that all that it really ends up doing is it tends to foreground and kind of focus our attention on more things, right? And so now we begin to look at the things that are maybe not apparent or not visible in front of us, but are instead the invisible structures that are setting up and organizing and predetermining the sort of conditions of what is actually there, or maybe our relationship to things. Versus, let's say, projects that to maybe become fully background and to become not the sort of a center of things, right? Because in the attempt to strip, it still inevitably becomes a sort of centering of things, becomes foreground. That it's actually quite the opposite. It's not about removing things, but it's about flooding things. If you think about noise and the way that noise is actually produces so much information that it becomes impossible to extract any one singular thing. And so that noise inevitably becomes just background, right? And so I think it's now when I say, you know, I think it's definitely a worthwhile kind of like experiment to go in and kind of ask these questions and kind of figure out where this takes you. But I think that you might find that you are not going to end up with the answer that you thought you were heading into this thesis with. Kind of trying to present.
That's okay.
I think yeah.
Go ahead.
You know, I mean, we know he's dealing with paradoxes, and I think that it's interesting, the question about context, you know, and I think it's also about representation, because I mean, it's as you guys were talking, I was thinking, well, you know, I mean, we're all really good at creating images like this that are typically thought of as architectural and devoid of anything real. They're purposely abstract, you know, and the fact that then you're trying to explore that though in a real way. I mean, that's what Herwig's question is like, okay, but you're actually saying, no, this is actually how it's built. It's not a rendering, right? Whereas many times, certainly in these kind of venues, we're perfectly comfortable to be in that level of abstraction. It's never asked like, oh, well, how would you actually make a 500-foot seamless white surface, you know, like, and for those of us who have tried to do this, things like that, you know, it's actually pretty hard to do. And then how would that have light in it? And, you know, what about the light switch and all these stupid things that we have to deal with? So I think you said that, at least to me, that you wish to convey that to that level of kind of tectonic to prove that it can be done. And I think it's more than a stair rendering to do that.
Yeah.
But then the other is though how it's represented. So I find this should be a real learning experience, the questions that come out of your presentation. And I say this to my students all the time, like, I can no longer help you with that because I've had too many conversations with you and I know the project too much, so I can never be fresh eyes looking at it. And now we have fresh eyes and you see the questions that come in, and they're really good questions and they're absolutely right, which means then either that's what your intention is, or you need to fill those gaps from now until the end in order to either address it more clearly if you wish, or to change the conversation, right?
Yeah,
I think it's super helpful for you, this discussion. And he has said that one idea is to stop this project right here and do another smaller one from now until midterm, which I don't know what you guys think. I tend to discourage that kind of thinking, but you know, it's your project, so you can go at it. But the idea, I think, was that a smaller thing would allow you to get into more detail. And then finally, I just want to ask the role of, you have said that what this really does is foreground human interaction, so that if we imagine this thing, and you purposely said it has no program, it is just public space. So there's no other reason than to gather, to walk, as if you, like the sidewalk has no program either. So it's just a thing, it's just a place of interaction. And then we're resistant, though, to show any imagery with people in it for lots of reasons. Yet that would demonstrate, like if you just had the corner of somebody's head with this background of a building, presumably everything that it's doing is foregrounding human interaction because everything's reduced. And this was, I think, Matthew's point about taking that further to other things that get foregrounded besides the literalness of people with minimalism. Anyway, I wrote a lot of stuff down. This is what I do for my students. So we go, and then on Friday, then we try to unpack where all you guys were coming from.
That's awesome.
It's a nice strategy. Okay. Oh, look at this. We're on time.
Thank you so much. That was really, really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Ozan.
Hello, everyone. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, I go. Screen share. Okay. So the title of my thesis is Estranging Architecture. This thesis explores methods of estrangement as a means of intervening on historic buildings. By appropriating the elements of historic buildings, a series of manipulations then ensue, including distorting, rescaling, removing, and shifting. In doing so, their conventional meanings and roles can be challenged and reappropriated in different spatial and formal conditions. So the case study selected for this thesis is the Bradbury Building in downtown LA, and the speculative estrangement takes the shape of an addition to the existing building that wraps around its backside from Broadway to the 3rd Street. So the investigation focuses on the two most renowned parts of the building, which are the facade and the ornate courtyard. And so the project operates on two scales, which are the urban scale with the facade, and then the interior scale with the courtyard and its details. So the first part of my thesis was this facade study, which I call Every Facade on the Bradbury Building, in reference to Ed Ruscha's Every Building on Sunset Strip. And for this, while taking elements from the existing facade of the Bradbury, I designed the facades of my annex to the building. And by doing that, I was applying the operations that I just mentioned, shifting, removing, distorting. And I try to challenge the inherent hierarchies of the facade, which is the top, middle, and the bottom, and the elements that separate these parts. And what is vertical made horizontal, again, to challenge those, and then ornaments enlarged for them to gain more spatial and formal meanings. Oh, sorry. And then this is the video of that facade study, but we can pass that for now, since I showed already. And so this is the drawing of the back facade, which has the most estrangement in the project. And this is the turntable video of that. So it wraps around the backside like that. Yeah. And then I moved on to the second part of the project, which is about the courtyards. And for the edition that I made, I designed two courtyards that are smaller versions of the existing Bradbury courtyard. And so I started with a careful investigation of the courtyard, and I formally analyzed it like that. And So the connection I propose is like you can see in this Wenzhi drawing, the existing courtyard entrance, the main gates of the Bradbury, and I extended this to this courtyard that I proposed, and I opened a new one to this side, to the other courtyard that I proposed. So it has a lot of details. Can I zoom in on that? Yeah. So especially the guardrails and the stairs are pretty ornate. And also we have this clear separation of the floor with material and the ornamentation and also the stairs, which we saw in this one with this material. So it's really a hierarchy of floor, stair kind of thing. So this is a close-up of the detail of it. You can see because it's easier to see without the black iron material. You can see, and then this one. Yeah. And this is a typical stair in the building with the landings. And this is the entrance stair, which is different than those ones. So that's like that. And so I could detail one of my courtyards so far, and the other one is still work in progress. So what I started with is I took the skylight of the existing building and I multiplied it several times, both on the roof and the walls and the bottom of the courtyard. So it's not a wall and then a skylight. So I thought I would challenge the roles and the meanings of this piece by repeating them in other places in the building. So overall, it looks like this, and it's actually a video. So when I did that, since the frequency of the multiplication is different, the structure suggested different heights for the floors. And then, so this led me to design a multi-story floor courtyard, which is in contrast to the existing Bradbury. And then that gave me the idea of also changing the material of the corridors to the stairs. So the whole circulation is a continuous loop like that. So there's not a clear distinction between the floors, even though I run a stair here. So yeah, this is the axonometric drawing. Another estrangement is, so this kind of setting divided up the ground floor into 4 playground kind of spaces. And then I used this railing piece and I extruded up. So it's like a seating / playground. And this is the non-material version, which shows more clear, I think. And so this is the circulation diagram that I was talking about. And so this is the section that you can see how you reach. So this is the main entrance of the Bradbury, and you go just next to the stair into the main courtyard. And then the corridor I open up is here. So you just follow this and then it takes you up, and then either you go down and then, or you go up to the other floors. Sorry. Okay, and this is the orthogonal view of that section. So this concave bottom of the new courtyard, just like the stairs sits on top of that, and then it either goes up or down. So that's the elevation, and that's the other elevation. And this is the side view, how the stairs sit on this piece, and then how the stairs work. And yeah, this is the Wenzhi video of that. Yeah. And the other courtyard is similar to this one, but less dense, while I multiply the skylight piece. So yeah, this is still in progress. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Is where you imagine this project ending, finishing this courtyard, or do you imagine it going someplace else.
You mean like as another project in my career, or?
No, I'm just wondering, like, where do you continue on from, let's say, mid-review? I can see, let's say, developing the second courtyard, but I'm just curious where in your mind, over the next I don't know, like 6-7 weeks that we have left, where do you imagine kind of ending? Are there any other questions that you want?
So the questions would be, so this estrangement so it's kind of like a sequential process. Like when you just estrange one thing and then it changes the next thing, and then it'll probably change the arrangement of the office floor that is outside the courtyard. And then this bottom piece is probably going to change where the ground floor is located, maybe sunk down. So it's from, like I cover the most interior side of the building and then the most exterior, which is the facade, and then it kind of informs the middle.
Yeah. Thanks, Rod. 4 weeks. Okay, so that's tight.
Yeah.
So I won't send you off on too many tangents, but I think maybe the thing that I'm kind of left wanting a little bit more of. So there are these moments when you tell us you're turning off the material, and it turns off the texture maps, it turns off the color, and we see this digital model that's a sort of blank thing. And I think maybe where I'm feeling like I'm wanting a little bit more in your project is I want you to turn up the material, meaning that I want you to like really look at the building as constructed and the material, and what does it mean to kind of scale a material in a standardized part, or scale a wrought iron piece. Like what are the sort of questions of this, not as a digital model, but as a sort of real material that's like a manufactured material, and how would that actually change some of these, change the building, and you'd be able to kind of tell a different story that would be maybe a bit more of a conceptual spin on a material history of the Bradbury building rather than a graphical history of the building itself. And I think that's probably, like, if I were to kind of add in, let's say, my own perspective, that's where I would kind of recommend going. I think others would give you a different comment, and I think that'll be kind of up to you to decide. But I think that would be like one area that I would, for me, at least for my input, would be to explore.
Thank you.
Ozan, I would be interested, and given there's 4 weeks left, so I'm going to curb my suggestions quite a lot. When you showed that panning elevation, I personally want you to turn up the estrangement. For me, it's a very safe, step-by-step, the decisions that you've been made, and just a very quick, estranged is about alienation, no longer affectionate, not on friendly terms. And I feel like you've been very friendly with your diversion away from what is to what was. And so here I was thinking, if this was, and this is a very low tech way of, let's say, estranging something, if this was a print and you threw water on it and it dripped, would that take on a different kind of estrangement than sort of clipping and turning and pushing in and pushing out? I like what you've done with the skylight at the end. I think that's like a very sort of beautiful, for me, feminine balletic, this part. But I felt like the elevation is very careful, and it made me think of Alexander McQueen's Plato's Atlantis, which is now 10 years old, where he literally alienated everybody with his collection, which I think was probably how he was feeling at the time. So for me, you obviously have to choose how you're going to spend the next 4 weeks, but I wonder if you could spend 4 hours trying a different method for creating an alienation that may surprise you, or it's completely against what you had in mind for the next 4 weeks, just as an experiment to see what may happen.
Yeah. I want to second that. I mean, I think it really feels more like a very careful restoration of the Bradbury building. It feels very Viennese to me, like you know, a lot of paying attention to details and then slightly modifying them. I would really amp that up as much as you can, you know, like estranging, you know, even like the the Blade Runner scene in that context is something that makes that building, it takes it into a different context, right? And so you're not really doing that. You're kind of staying within the architecture very much. And I agree, this is probably your best part. And so maybe it's a way of maybe focusing on this piece and but you know, and maybe also think about maybe a different materiality where things become really. I mean, I just don't know what to do with these details that you had before, which you obviously spent a lot of time modeling them, and then changing very little at them. And so the estrangement happens at the level more like, okay, if I'm the architect and just trying to change very little to that detail, you have to be almost like a historian to understand what happened. I also agree with the comment about the facade just being clipping and turning things feels not really an estrangement. It almost feels like a postmodern kind of, you know, taking elements and putting them on their head or pulling them out and doing other things with it. But it doesn't really feel like it's strange necessarily. I mean, for example, maybe it's playing with the scale, or maybe playing with the materiality, or as Lucy was suggesting, melting the thing. And that can also happen very subtly. You know, it doesn't have to happen in a kind of a grand, like splashing paint on this thing. But like, you know, if parts of this piece start becoming rubber and start dripping, you know, and then turning back into brick, like that kind of like that feeling of like that is a little bit where it becomes uncomfortable. I think you need to produce a little bit more uncomfort here. It's too comfortable.
Yeah. It's interesting. I guess in some ways I would double down on the things you're working on the interior. Like I think in actuality, the rule set for the formation of the exterior of the Bradbury building, the kind of base, middle, top, like I agree with all the comments that you're trying to achieve estrangement through a rule set shift and you're not really achieving it. But at the end of the day, I feel like estrangement in relationship to that facade is kind of low-hanging fruit. And with the interior pieces, you're in the much weirder territory where it doesn't seem old and it doesn't seem new. It seems uncanny in a way. And so it is kind of alienating and compelling at the same time. So I feel like in terms of what you're working on those inner shells, that's where to me, that's where it's really happening. Yeah.
And maybe also there might be like an estrangement of the interior space in the way how you use the space, how you walk in the space, how it is kind of like utilized. So it's not only about the geometry or the treatment of the surface, but that's a way how you can interact with the building in a way that can be different. Since the building has been used, has had already like different programs inside of it throughout the years. So it may become something completely new again.
Yeah.
I would just say that I think you're in a good spot to be able to what was the word? Amp it up, ramp it up, turn up the volume. If you wish. He has worked super methodically all summer. I'm super impressed on how he's You know, it's a little bit like Stockholm syndrome. You model this thing and then you become enslaved by it or fall in love with it, right? Because then you almost respect it too much, because he spent so much time really documenting this building as half of it. And so, you know, maybe you're resistant to really messing it up a little bit too much.
Maybe,
So that might be a good challenge for you to think about. But there was another part of his thesis that had to do with, sorry?
I think you need to become estranged with it, like separate yourself from it, get a divorce or have a fight or whatever you need to do to be able to fall back in love with it, but in a different kind of embrace.
And I think, I'm not sure you mentioned it in your presentation, but at times you've talked about 3 different levels of it operating in 3 different ways. Kind of like you use the word off, Ozan, like kind of off, you know, or that's off, or that's really off, right?
Yeah.
So I think the subtle ones are also interesting to me, like and then there's notions of the copy, and is it really a copy? And I think this also talks about how to deal with historic buildings in different ways. But if you can, maybe it's the 3rd chapter that you really just need to work on for the next, and kind of keep everything else, but work on that next level.
Yeah,
good.
I agree.
All right, Eli, you're up.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a good day.
Hello. Okay. All right. So hospitals are symbols of civic largesse and medical well-being, but they're also filled with people that are facing their greatest medical or personal crises. So as a place for addressing such crises, the efficiency and safety of the design is an ethical rather than a utilitarian imperative. So hospital designs are usually carved out in the name of efficiency above all else. And these kinds of designs, usually get rows of rooms packed along corridors, which invite easy comparisons to prisons. But the cost of this efficiency is that such environments may amplify the sense of disadvantage in patients coping with involuntary passivity from illness. So my thesis is subverting prison and hospital formal design cliches to overcome the sense of disempowerment and confinement in patients at the hospital. So the site is a hole in the ground in Upper Manhattan, which contains an exposed tunnel for I-95 that runs between the Bronx and New Jersey. The neighborhood is mainly residential, but with a highway running through it. So the hospital on this site is meant to broadcast a positive message about the value of scientific know-how within the community, and also from the community to the commuters driving between New Jersey and Westchester. So here you have a closer look at the hole in the ground. You've got a street level, and then you've got the highway level underneath it. And this is what it looks like from the highway. So there's the George Washington Bridge in the background. This is the proposed massing. So it doesn't cover the entire hole. And there's a structural lattice on the hospital exterior that extends down into the highway. And this way, it's treating the highway itself as the building's public space, and it unifies the street and highway levels, allowing drivers to pass through the building or be stuck in traffic in it, as the case may be. All right, so the hospital program can be divided broadly into 3 zones: the inpatient clinical zone, where the patients sleep; the outpatient consulting clinical zone, where they don't sleep, but they get treated; and then the support spaces, which have labs, offices, administration, laundry, kitchens. And these are areas where the patients don't usually go. It's where you go to the hospital and it says, don't go here. So 2 ways I'm going to change the patient's relationship to the institution. One is integrating the program, which would be something like what you see on the right. So mixing in the support areas, sort of the backstage areas with where the patients go. And the other thing is exposing these areas as they're integrated. So, all right, so let's go through our program. So here's the inside of the hospital. All right, so first let's look at the areas where the medical experts are treating their patients. They are distributed throughout the volume of the building instead of all being in one place at the appropriate floor. So reorganizing the program by medical subspecialty as opposed to the type of the facility makes it more convenient for the patient, and it also puts the patient closer to the aspects of the hospital organization that's providing the treatment, and it may also raise the standard of care by bringing the various collaborating clinicians and caregivers and staff closer touch with one another as they're all around the same patients that they're treating. Okay, so then mixed in on each of the floor areas for invasive procedures, surgeries, and then here are places where just exam rooms where patients will just meet with their clinicians. And then here are the in-between spaces, the support areas. So for meetings, administration, cleaning, washing, and there's no walls around these areas, they're exposed. So as the patients circulate, they can look down into these areas and sort of be connected to the areas and the people who are working in the hospital. And so around the perimeter of the place is the rooms where the patients, the inpatients are sleeping. And here they are. And then this little area is where the intensive care is. All right, other stuff. So here's a little drive-through in the hospital, and here you have the service areas on the left, and you have the emergency room on the right, and you have 3 cores. Here you have the main core for just about everything. Here you have a service core that goes to the morgue. And here you have the, a little core for the emergency room that connects it to the main volume of the rest of the hospital. So here's the core with all the circulation, and here's the entire emergency area. And then here you have the stuff, that's radioactive. You always have to put that all together, thick walls. And here you have some lab spaces. And lastly, pharmacy and a cafeteria on the roof. Okay, so the manner in which the support areas and the clinical areas interface changes the patient's positions in the scheme of things. So in prisons, as we see here, the inmates are in the cells or in the periphery, and they're in constant display to the guards in the inaccessible tower in the middle. In my proposal, all the walls are removed, except for the procedure and the exam in the bedrooms for the patient's privacy. So this would be like a diagram of a typical hospital floor. And so this is showing where the patients go, their rooms on the outside and the circulation in the middle. And then these are the treatment areas. And then here are the exposed working support areas. And this way the patients look down and into the support areas as they circulate, and this will connect the patients to the work of the hospital and elevates the patients within it. So you can see that relationship as we sweep through the hospital and plan. So you can see here, like when we cut through the floors, you can have those little lowered support areas. And then there's also gaps, atrium that are a large one over here and the smaller ones within the floor that allows patients to be connected to more places in the hospital. And as we get down toward the lobby, you can see the way this lattice structure goes into the hole, and you can see where the cars drive through the hospital on their way to Thanksgiving. Also, the exterior of the building is porous, so this is also sort of going against the the prison notion. You've got holes in the walls, the seams are kind of exposed, and here in section you can also see the the atria, and you can see how the core the volume of the core wraps around and becomes the lattice that goes into the hole. And one more last series of sections here, and that is it. Thank you.
Yeah, very detailed hospital. For me, it was kind of a bit of a learning curve of actually what goes on within the walls of a hospital. It makes me think you know, what do you get when you expose the backstage? And what I feel like could happen is that, you know, I'm sure we've all been in hospital, whether it's for good or bad things, that actually what you do is you watch other people or you listen to other people's conversations, or you're trying to, you know, pass time somehow. And so what happens by exposing the backstage is the backstage becomes a kind of theater of distraction for people who are needing care, which I think is really interesting. So does that mean that, you know, I wonder whether that would have an effect on how people rehabilitate more quickly, or whether people seem more not at ease within a hospital. I think it's interesting that you've chosen a hospital just from the beginning. I would be interested in why you have done that. It's a very particular space, but from what I can see, I mean, I like this idea of being stuck in traffic in the hospital, and then sort of this prison hospital interface. Why did you choose a hospital?
Well, the reason I chose a hospital is I wanted to do a building that had a really rigorous program. Because the well, I mean, it has to do with the, you know, the way the studios have been in SCI-Arc for me, where it's always been sort of designing from the outside in, and I wanted for this project to try and pay closer attention to the inside, so I picked a program that was, you know, just had way too much to deal with. You know.
A hospital is a really, really complicated, as I'm sure you're well aware, machine, you know, and there's a reason why it's really difficult to touch it. But if I look at this image that you have on the screen right now, that does not look like a hospital. And it has a lot more playfulness to it. It has form to it. It suggests there's some large open spaces, much more like a public building, or like even, I don't know, some sort of a gallery that's happening there in the front. So, I mean, it's really, I think its appearance from the outside it communicates something very different. And then when we look at the kind of organization on the inside, it becomes much more conventional again. And I think maybe the question, since you are really focused and it sounds like in detail familiar with the different parts and components of a hospital, I'm sure you also have thought about like what the critique is of how people recover and what their experience is in a hospital. And if you're trying to change that experience, you know, thinking about the patient and the interaction, not only with her or his doctors, but also with visitors to that place, or the kind of like approach. There's different approaches other than Western medicine to medicine, right? So that would require different environments, or different kind of like way of treating people. I think you have, I mean, if this hospital is trying to be inclusive in the terms of this is not just a standard hospital, but also it's trying to, and I would assume it does that, because just looking at it, it's suggesting that through its kind of form, you know, that there is something else happening in there. You know, this is not cedar cyanide where I have to look at 15 plans to get to my patient room and up this elevator and down that through a labyrinth of spaces. This has a clear kind of like hierarchy. There's a, you know, and so I would want to know what these like big open spaces are and how they actually can contribute to changing our experience in hospitals. And you know, also maybe also kind of a shift, a critique on medicine and how it's being executed, you know, very efficiently. And you know, maybe it does require some other kind of like elements to it that are not just about like getting the patient in and out of there, but maybe elongating how, you know, people stay in an environment or different stages of an environment. So there's intensive care, then you get to your room, but then usually in the US, you get kicked out of the hospital after that as quickly as possible. So maybe this hospital offers maybe an alternative kind of like idea about like recovery. And I think it would be important to add that to this thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's interesting, Eli. It's either incredibly brave or incredibly ill-advised today to tackle the program with this level of complexity and this level of kind of rule sets built in to generate very specific outcomes. But I like the way you're thinking about the problem, and I like what Lucy described as this kind of theater of distraction, having all the floors kind of open to one another with only cellular spaces where they need to be cellular. I wonder about the image of the project, and I don't have a problem with it necessarily, but I wonder if there's a kind of naked version of the project where you're not trying to sort of swoop it up or dress it up or create some overlay for it. Like there's something, maybe it's necessary, but when the loose cellularity peeks through and the complex ramping circulatory system peeks through, it sort of speaks to the kind of image of it as a result of relationships that I find really interesting. And I wonder if the kind of monolithic plaster surface is sort of getting in the way of that. But
I wonder, yeah, what was I? It was listening to some show, it might have been like Marketplace or something, where they're talking about some of the issues that happened in New York at the height of the pandemic, and in large part trying to get people care and ICU beds that desperately needed it. And it seemed like the main thing that kept coming up, or at least within this report, was this difference between a privatized hospital versus a public hospital, and the agreement and negotiations with emergency trips, negotiations between patients, the number of patients that can be taken, who would be taken, et cetera. And you had these conditions where you would have hospitals that were almost empty, private hospitals that were almost empty, that were not taking patients. And then you had a hospital in Queens that was just overflowing. And I think maybe it's a tricky thing with your project, because that kind of points to an administrative critique of hospitals, and a critique about, let's say, privatized versus public, things like that. That in the critique of your project, I'm wondering if you are, in a way, kind of antagonizing the support staff and antagonizing the right. And so I'm just wondering whether or not that, like, I want to, like, my sort of urge is to kind of tamp that down, because I think it is it's producing somewhat of a straw man of the out of the emergency care workers that I think I feel uncomfortable with. And so I'm just wondering if there's a sort of another way of presenting it, maybe not presenting it through the Foucault model, which kind of amplifies that critique, but instead just kind of talking about it relative to ideas of care and visibility and awareness. And you don't need the Foucault in there.
Huh. So do you think more like just talking about I don't know, not the disempowerment, but just that in this proposal, the access to patients and the interface between the patients and the clinicians is different, rather than like the patients are feeling bad and they're feeling like they're in a prison, like that's too heavy. Your mic is off, Matthew. Sorry.
Sorry about that. That might be too heavy because I think in your setup it was a sort of attempt to kind of invert roles, right?
Yeah.
But I think in the inversion, I think it's still kind of leaving it to like two parties, but then like the larger problem is actually this third party that is somehow not anywhere present in your critique, right? And so yeah. And so I think it's just like, you know, you can talk about it in relationship to a history of hospital organizations and designs, and propose this as another sort of version of that continues in a sort of way of examining client sort of patient-doctor relationships, but not one that's coming at this from a position of, let's say, pure critique.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, I get it. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing. I know we're running out of time, but we've been talking about, of all things, John Portman quite a lot. And I think you should be maybe more overt about that model, you know, of the super atrium, you know, I think Herwig is right to say that the oddness of, and we've talked about this, a building that at least seems to be making a big public space, almost in a civic way, even though it's really not occupied and it's kind of a hole in the ground. I mean, like from this view, one expects this to be some kind of, I don't know, city hall or something like that. And I think that's purposeful, which is to say that the hospital can engage the city at that level, and why not? You know, so it's trying to operate on an urban level that way, and I think you can articulate that more and be more overt about it. And I'm glad someone else thinks that big blank weird shape is a problem. Thank you, Darin. I think this building would be actually more, maybe it would normalize it, but even if it's a kind of curtain wall building and then it's just this shape, but it's not this solid thing, like that, maybe it's just back to the language of Portman, of glass, and kind of, you know, that's okay. And then there's geometry, and that's where the rub is. But I want to just, lastly, I just want to say that, you know, Eli has a lot of knowledge of this subject matter, and he is taking it seriously, and it's kind of refreshing for me to have somebody who's like really trying to work things out in a building like maybe we all do in our offices and have to do things like that, but in a thesis. And so he's very cognizant of that. It's a challenge, and he is bringing that to the project. And of course, I've encouraged it from the beginning, even if I don't even understand a lot of the rules of these hospitals that he does, but that's okay. He's you know, becoming, let's say, the expert on that. But the proof is then to see maybe some of the other things he's learned along the last 3 years of his education can be, let's say, rubbed up against that. In a way, it's a very professional project, and I think that's okay too. It's a little odd in thesis to have projects like that, and I like that.
Can I say one last thing before we move to the next presentation? I agree with you, John, and Darin about like this weird, like swirling shape in a way that I don't know why, but it really reminds me to the book The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. That it talks about like this guy like that goes to the sanatorium and stays there for like 7 years, in a way that it seems like this sort of like cathedral, like very nice, beautiful cathedral where you're kind of like stuck in it. But I think you're actually, and we haven't talked about that so much. I think you're doing a very interesting thing actually with the ground. And I'm wondering if instead of like working with the shape of the building itself, if you would make something more human, so to say, and less feeling like like enclosed in the space, if it's possible, kind of like working with the ground. If there is an idea of like working with kind of the outside space, and that might become like a new part of the hospital, where you're not secluded anymore within a room, but you are actually in a sort of like more open environment. Because I think there is like a lot in there that it's sort of like it's shown, but it wants to stay behind, whether I think it has to fight and be a little bit more brave. So I would maybe just reconsider a little bit like all the elements that you have in the project, and you can focus on maybe some different ones. But yeah, I agree. It's like it's an extremely difficult project, especially like right now. You're super brave.
Thanks. Well, thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you, Eli.
And a great midterm.
All right. So, Brad.
Hi, everyone. Let me start sharing my screen real quickly.
Are we supposed to open our presents now, or?
That's to the end.
This is the end?
Okay. Yeah.
I have it right here.
Perfect.
I don't have a
only
present.
The exclusive people receive the present.
Clearly.
Oh, not everyone got one, Red?
And not necessarily. I was trying to figure out the logistics with Lorenzi earlier.
I see.
But first, I'm going to start off with my thesis statement and then go into the actual presentation just to make sure that I cover all the bases and then do everything else. So this is Atelier Ego. Branding, marketing, and retail space have progressed as a space of leisure since the invention of Edwardian arcades or the suburban department stores, the evolution of the flaneur into the contemporary mall walkers. The Christmas fronts at Bergdorf's have become a recognized New York tradition. The organization of department stores like Nordstrom have become a familiar convention, and the iconic Tiffany blue box an object of social status. Reimagining this well-known public space and activity is crucial at this time. Big box stores and suburban malls have been crippling, while online retail hasn't been responding to opportunities to innovate. In times of economic changes, the rise of Amazon as a major e-commerce superpower, and even in contemporary social crises of social isolation as stores resemble early stages of abandonment and general public yearns to participate in the public sphere. Retail space has the perfect opportunity to assimilate itself to a space that creates a new tension between a space and its user. In a time where high-end retail still depends on brick and mortar stores to generate upwards to 85% of their profit, retail needs to be rethought as a space of personalized consumption. Creating this experience borrows from the idea of haute couture, where garments are made to order. No two are identical, whether it comes from fit to techniques used. The hybrid model of physical and digital space is exemplified through a stripped-down reappropriation of space that has the ability to adapt to new fashion seasons as changing trends through a digital AR platform. The products start their lives as generic objects like a milk crate, a plastic bag, a coffee can. However, a new epidermis would act as an applique that reinvents the system of assigning value to consumer goods, reimagining the whole role and function of these goods as status symbols without necessarily having an exchange of currency. This questions contemporary ideas of consumerism and defines an entirely new playing field for the game that successful retailers currently play. As the season progresses, the draped epidermis of these new status symbols start to deteriorate off the generic object, stripping of its social status and creating a need for the casual shopper to come back to the store to update and reapply the newest and most trendiest custom coding. The only way to receive a custom epidermis is through the experience of the newest level of the store, creating a three-way symbiotic relationship between the patron, the product, and the store. Each new version becomes a souvenir of the experience as it transforms the generic object into an object of luxury and consumeristic desire. While the digital architectural overlay adapts to the characteristics of temporality as well as weightlessness, sourcing its inspiration from fast fashion. Creating the symbiosis of physical and digital generates a new architectural system by detaching the architecture from the building to activate the space. So then this is kind of my presentation with Atelier Ego. Sources of aesthetic comes from Pussy Crew for Burberry, where they overlap digital and physical, as well as context of Hermes breeding its own crocodiles, as well as the snake community breeding their own new types of snakes. So this kind of sets up the parafiction for the rest of my project. This is Rodeo Drive right when the pandemic hit. So that was Saint Laurent and Prada, where you see these stores completely empty with no product inside.
Do you love to shop?
Consumer research.
You know what? You know what? What? I do. You do. I do too. And you know what? I like to go to stores. I want to touch it. You know what I mean? Okay. I'm like
you're hands-on.
Yes, like Marie Kondo says to like, you know, like pick things up and see if you want them, and if it doesn't give you joy, get rid of it. Yeah. I'm the opposite. Okay. I want to pick up things I don't even care about and just be like, what is it? Let me touch it and smell it, and then like, I don't want it. Let
me rub it all over my body.
Yeah.
So the consumer isn't necessarily being targeted as like the luxury consumer. It's kind of everyone through the spectrum, everyone from like the casual shopper that will buy only the necessities when they need, all the way to like the shopping addict. The generic objects that I've spoken previously about are these like container objects as like industrial versions of purses, where they kind of don't have any materiality as of yet until you come into the store and until you experience the space to have that applique applied. So the melanin that I've kind of encompassed through these material samples is a gradient as shown on screen. And then these are the samples that I've created over the past couple weeks. So you could see different textures, different tones throughout, as well as like different materiality. And different techniques used to stitch them together. Also, these objects have a way to become very tectonic through creating like a section, as well as almost creating a fully, something that's like very physical with the detail as to a render of the material layered. And then the store kind of acts as the target to the app. So you can't really have one without the other. So it creates that dynamic dependency of you going to the store to kind of experience the space itself. And then these are kind of like different versions of each time you go into the store. So the first column is, let's say you go in the first time, then you have the material decay, and then you go in the next time. And then I'm kind of like doing market or target market through like Snapchat filters, where it kind of attacks you in your own home. And then you kind of have this desire to go in to get like the physical aspect of it. And then these are my model photos. And then I kind of created a version of the app for everyone to kind of experience. So hold on, let me, and then this is also a great opportunity for you guys to open up the packages as well. So you could feel free to explore the app as well as open up the materials. Feel free to share experiences.
It's really beautiful.
Thank you.
It actually sticks surprisingly well.
Yeah. So you could open up the plastic packaging.
Is it Ziploc or can I cut it?
Cut it. Yeah, I didn't have the bags that kind of rip open. That's for
Okay.
files.
Can we make them edible next time?
Wait, they're not?
Unfortunately not. They're so inviting.
Oh, they feel great.
Yeah.
So they kind of exist in like multiple levels, I guess. So like the physical that some of you guys have, as well as in the app. I don't know if you guys want to tour it by yourself, but this would be kind of like a first version of the interface that you'd kind of use to experience the space.
Do we have to put the email address, or we just have to click on sign in?
It's in the chat.
Okay.
It should open up.
No, but when you open the app, it asks you for your email and your password.
Oh, no. You just put sign in and you're good to go.
Okay.
And then the white background render is kind of like a hold for the physical. So like the way that I'm representing is through my background currently, where the actual shelves are physical, but everything else is digital.
My brain's it's so great. It's physical. You've got that element of digital, and then when you started talking, the things behind you started changing color. So I wasn't listening to everything that you were saying because I was like, is that a background? Is that real? How is he doing that? So just the first thing, would I bring in my own generic object?
Yeah, so it's kind of like this blank generic object that you kind of have, so it doesn't really hold that much like social meaning, I guess. So that's why I kind of use the example of like a milk crate. Like a milk crate is very like utilitarian. You could like use it for X amount of things, but once you kind of into the store and like have this like custom new skin, that's when it's no longer just it's no longer just a milk crate. It's this like social status object, and then it kind of creates a loop where that that epidermis that's placed onto it acts as like an organic object or organic skin by deteriorating and forcing you to come back to the store to get a new one. If that's like the shopper that you are, versus someone who's addicted to shopping where they will constantly want a new version of the skin.
Of the same one.
Not necessarily the same one. The way that I see it is that it's a new version of the skin, and the I should call it epidermis. So this new version of the epidermis kind of reflects on how you interacted with the space in the first place. So that's why the like object of desire is a souvenir of the experience rather than just like a product off the shelf.
Mm-hmm. And would I see it being dipped or draped over the generic object, or it's kind of taken away and I come back the next time? Or
that kind of isn't ironed out yet, but I could kind of see it going either way. That's kind of where I'm at right now.
Yeah, so it could be a laboratory where you see it, the actual, because I think I love that you're examining retail, because right now nobody is shopping physically, but what you're doing is you're creating like a happening, like a kind of event where you have to go to get this kind of stuff that's not available anywhere else. So I think that's like a really clever way to like ceremonialize or create this kind of shamanic retail experience where you kind of come back to worship the epidermis. So when you say it deteriorates as a material, it
either crumbles off, falls apart. It's no longer usable, I guess. That's the way that I see it.
I'm with Lucy. I think that this is all amazing. I think the parts, what maybe needs development is the performance that happens at the store. And so, you know, if we think about, on one hand, there's like this, the sun tanning booths, performance at sun tanning booths or at makeup stands, but then there's also like the performance when you take your dog to go get groomed, and they take it back into that back window, and it's like all exposed and it's glass all the way around. You see like all the other like dogs around it, like seeing like all these other objects also being like, or like draped on or whatever, like this extra stuff. But then so there's that aspect that's maybe yet to kind of develop with it, or to kind of really kind of make it quite like spectacular of an event. But then there's the sort of other aspect of the maybe it's, and I don't know how much you want to go there, but there is the negative aspect of like when these things do crumble, what that does to the streets, what that does to your house. Like now all of a sudden your kitchen drain is always clogged because this skin crumble is always like clogging up all of your plumbing. And so what does that kind of do to the way that you now also have to live with the sort of waste product of the product of what you're creating?
I guess I would kind of like argue that creating this like cycle has this like level of sustainability, because you're not really creating a whole new box or like a whole new item again for like the newest season or like whatever. It only is that surface level material, as opposed to like having to recycle the entire like plastic milk crate to get a new one. And like same thing with the like physical space of the store, where there is a level of blankness to it that hosts this like superficial level of AR that could constantly change. And I guess that's kind of the dynamic tension between the actual object of desire versus the store, where they both kind of act in the same level of superficiality, where sure, the object of desire has this physical drape, and then the space has the digital drape over it.
So that only happens in the store. Is that the kind of rub to it, that the digital only gets overlapped at a specific place?
The digital overlap kind of reflects the new version of the game. So each time you go into the store, there's like a new superficial level of like, let's say these 3 components or whatever, those are new, and unique to yourself. And the way that you interact with these, like through the app that I sent out, the way that you kind of like choose through it, you kind of get awarded this skin that you're able to apply to your object.
Got it.
So it becomes like a reward system.
Is it? I think that the evolution of the materials and the exploration of the materials as they relate to objects is super compelling. And I guess I wonder in your mind if there's room for less clear delineation between the store and the object realm, meaning can some of the things that you learned in the material and object realm be applied to the store? For me, the most interesting moments were the little models where the pieces were draped and they were suggesting kind of changing rooms or kind of theatrical moments. And I don't know if that's part of the intention, but I guess to me, to make that split and say, oh, the store is digital drape and then the objects are physical drape, I wonder if that's a missed architectural opportunity.
I haven't really like thought about that as a possibility, but I definitely could kind of see me tackling that before finals. You're muted, Lucy.
I wonder and this is likely a terrible analogy, but like when you go and get your nails done, there's sort of like this, you're having what you feel like at the time moment put on your nails, they kind of get chipped and then you go back and you get it done. Whether, and because you mentioned kind of the superficiality of the process, like what Matthew said about it being a performance, and this idea of getting people to get up off their chairs and go to retail. I know there's brands that are thinking about how they're going to do that, and so I think the epidermis is obviously the main protagonist here of the reason for going to the store. But I wonder then how it becomes a performance whilst you're there, whether the augmented reality part of the shop is more important, and do you even need that? Could it be the dermis and the performance of the draping of it, the physicality of the object? How does the AR elevate the experience even more?
The way that I was kind of thinking about that is that it's, I guess, kind of like a critique on architecture in a way, where architecture has kind of like a much slower process when it comes to like, or compared to like fashion, where things are much more rapid pace in like the fashion industry, as opposed to construction. Like by the time that you're done with creating like the CD set and going through permits and like whatnot, your initial concept is no longer like valid, because it might be 2 years, 3 years since you started that, as opposed to something that's super digital that has the ability to rapidly change. And then like the physical aspect of the store has some sort of like vague structure to it that hosts this rapidly changing layer of the architecture.
Yeah, I guess for me, I just would be careful between the line of a billboard being constantly updated and changing as a campaign, the latest season, and how what that means to your sort of provocation.
I guess it wouldn't really be a billboard, or at least the way that like I'm looking at it. The way that like I see this like AR level is creating this like very unique experience per individual. And so it's basically like an interactive billboard that the way that you play with it creates this new skin.
So that's part of the performance.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Got it.
I'm thinking about like all of these various experiences that you do go to either like a retail store or you go to a sort of recurring thing like a hairdresser or I don't know, any sort of things. And in each case, there's always part of the performance is also there's a degree of vulnerability that you place yourself into when you go there. So, and I think that was like, so I don't know, if you're getting your hair cut, you know, sort of, you no longer have control. You're kind of strapped to this chair and somebody's kind of basically cutting your hair. If you go to a tanning salon, there's a sort of kind of stripping down. And I think that in the OMA Prada in LA, the changing rooms that were the clear glass that had the electrified sort of opaqueness, I think that played with that vulnerability. And that's what made the experience of going to Prada a sort of like a thing that you do because you kind of want to kind of put yourself in that position and then kind of feel and experience that degree. And so I'm wondering whether or not the objects, like I think there's a sort of, I know you wanted to have an object that is just kind of blank, a sort of anonymous object, that the experience of taking that object in to have the skin updated, there isn't a sort of an initial attraction, right? Or association to that object that puts the user in a state of vulnerability and handing that over. And I'm wondering if like how you can kind of think through like ways in which like, you know, I'm handing my object over. It's like when I take my dog to get groomed, it's like, I love this thing with all of my life. And now I'm like handing it over in somebody else's hands to kind of be cleaned up. But, and so I'm wondering like how you begin to kind of introduce those types of relationships.
But then that kind of places, like same thing with the like nail salon, the barbershop, pet groomers, that kind of places the responsibility onto someone else. Rather in this scenario, I see it as the user kind of dictates its own outcome. So it's kind of creating a space for you to do your own nails, for you to cut your own dog's hair, without necessarily having the ability to do that in your home.
And how does it do that?
By this like AR, so the way that you interact with all of the AR in the space creates the like skin for you to apply onto the generic object. So let's say like you go in, let's say on Wednesday, you interact with the space one way, so the outcome is going to be X. You go back on Tuesday, and then you interact with it a different way, the outcome of the skin is going to be Y, and so on and so forth. That's why each time you go into the space is a different like level within the like game of retail.
So it's like taking your temperature. It's like an emotional barometer of that time.
Basically, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder how the performance can be represented. I think it's one of the kind of main issues right now, because since you're working with like so many different levels of like reality and like the physical space, it's a very big component. I'm wondering like through Zoom, through the digital, what can you do? How can you like kind of bring the people and really kind of immerse them into the space that you want to have them to create for themselves? Because it's not even that you are creating the space, you're kind of like lacking the sort of authority here. You're giving the authority to whoever is coming to your space. And yeah, in terms of like representation, I really don't know, and that's a little bit of a question for the jury. I don't know what direction you could go for. I think it's very tricky.
What did you say? It's very
tricky. I think it's difficult. I think like sending, for example, the silicon things, it helps. It's already like a first approach to finally something that we can touch. We are allowed to touch. But I'm wondering how to move from like these into the bigger stage, like the space itself.
And maybe you could make a movie of that experience.
Mm-hmm.
That's the product. Because I mean, you have to put some sort of I mean, you're telling a story. You either write it down and then that's the thesis, or you visualize it somehow. And I think it could be a fantastic movie if that's, you know, collage together with these different ideas, so and narrate it in a way so that that's the presentation. Yeah. And it seems like you have done a lot of the writing for the story already, so it would be going through and working through this in a format that's, you know, that communicates that whole idea to a jury. And then the samples are basically the parts that you can touch, you mail it out. And I think that's a nice touch to it as well.
I think you need some influencers doing live stories.
Yeah. I mean, I really like that, you know, I started looking and seeing like who got samples, and like Lourenco got one and it pops up, and then he sends like a little movie of his detail. And then as Lucy said, like your background, like maybe you do have like friends for your final thesis presentation, like in this format, have stuff kind of pop up or using some of that, like, and maybe you don't even tell everyone, or maybe you tell about a couple, and then there's others that are surprises, and it's a little bit uncurated. But like, I also like these juries when we don't have any images and we're like this, and we can all kind of talk a little bit and pause without always looking at the project. I don't know, maybe there's something to that that's more about breaking down, because so much of what you're talking about is a kind of digital versus a physical, and admitting the kind of paradox in a way of retail. You know, I mean, people have been saying retail is dead for like a long time, but then it always repops up in a different way, right? And so, and I think it is like the little film clip that you said, you know, with this person saying, you know, but I still like to touch stuff, you know. I mean, there's something about the activity of shopping that has nothing to do with consumerism, but it maybe has to do with just a humanness of connection with people and things, you know. For sure, it's also a consumerist issue, but I think, I don't think it's a architectural project with a capital A. Like, I don't think I would say, okay, I want to see this suit in the Prada store and develop the shelf and all that stuff. I don't think that's your wheelhouse for this kind of thing. And I mean, you can, you could, or maybe partially a little bit of hint of that, but I think this other aspect of presenting it, weird samples sent to people 2 days before, which totally freaked me out, by the way, Rad. You know, like, this is my haven here. No one comes in here, not even my employees. They order prints and I deliver it to them from the door. This is like I had to like clean my hands already because I touched this stuff. So, you know, he came to my office the other day and I was like, what are you doing? Who are you? But even that I liked, you know, so it's like you're probably the only student that I've seen since March 10th.
I feel special.
But I remembered it. I remembered it. and this is the first model that I've gotten, you know. And by the way, it's attacking my model. I'm making sure it's like a new skin there. It's a vast improvement to that project.
One thing, just another thought. In the beginning, you read a script, let's say, But I feel like you know and you can defend this project so well that I feel like I'm more engaged with you when we're having this conversation or when you're not reading. So for you to kind of learn a script and then in the beginning talk off script, and maybe if we're talking about presentation ideas, like, are you, were you the architect on this project, or were you the brand that commissioned it, or are you someone who works at the retail store, or did you invent the epidermis? Whether you could talk through a character within this world to give it just a different kind of point of view. Not that we don't need to be more engaged or more intrigued, but just because this is quite performative in itself. So yeah, in terms of the presentation, maybe you could do that.
I kind of use that as like a crutch because like I know that I have a habit of kind of like skipping big chunks of my project during presentation. So that's why I kind of like opened it with it to make sure I have all the bases covered, and then went into like a more casual presentation of the actual project.
That for me, that I listen less because it's so, I'm not getting your eye contact. So I'm more engaged when you're natural as opposed to scripted. That's just my point of view.
Yeah, I definitely can't argue with that.
Take the jump. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Red.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
So we have one last one. Jiayue, are you ready?
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. Can you see my screen? All right, okay. So my project investigates the question of what does it mean to consider building in geological time. Looking at Robert Smithson's land art projects, partially buried wood and spiral jetty, his work demonstrates the idea of working with geological information and time, and also illustrating the concept of entropy. Then how can we imagine architecture in such manner? So on the bottom, through the early experiments, which I used solid cast plaster and wood frame to construct the model, then soak it into salt water. 2 weeks later, the wood started to rot, and it grew salt on top of the frame. So it demonstrates the idea of the material and form of the building would change over time in response to the environment. So as showing here in the conceptual diagram. So located at the edge of Mono Lake, this project is a landmark that designs to transform gradually throughout the time in relation to the local geological timeline. The program changes from a research lab to artist's residence. The change of program over time argues for that the architecture cannot be exhausted by its use. Rather, it documents the existence beyond usage. As the environment constant changes through layers of material shown in the sectional diagram, the project investigates the possibility of embracing the properties of unstable form and the raw material qualities of the building in the matter of breakdown and transformation. The design of the project combines the element appears as thick mat and thin surfaces to anticipate how it would behave differently throughout the time. This is just showing each part exploded individually as constructed systems. It has the brace blocks as an outer skin, and the inners are the combination of a solid construction and also steel framing.
so that the brace block and steel structure would decay and break down first. Then the stone mass would be left for remain as a new form. And the images in sequence are showing how it would change over time and generate a new existence for each stage. So that the architecture is a display of environmental reality and also to document a documentation of geological time. Yeah, that's it.
Could you go back to the last 3 images, the 3 renders, and like maybe give us, is there a time between them? Does one come before the other, or
yeah,
just
so it's
describe
from, yeah, it starts from left with the whole building, so with the whole building constructed, and then over time the outer brace block would decay first, and then at the end it will the inner stone mass would remain.
Feels like that the steps are a little bit too far apart. I mean, I kind of like that first model that you showed, the plaster wood model. And maybe like maybe doing a stop motion of like, even if it's a fake stop motion kind of a video that shows the kind of like slow deterioration and being washed away and being falling. And I mean, it needs to, it feels like it goes from this kind of conceptual idea that works really well in art. And the question is, how do you bring that across in architecture? And I mean, I'm just not so sure you can do that by removing elements. Like it seems very clean, the version that's coming out of it. And I think you want to contaminate a lot more with, you know, showing how this kind of like changes not only its shape but also its materiality, and like, you know, it can be designed in a way that there is different kind of lifespan of these materials, and what are they, you know. And it's even like to kind of create like some sort of a fake reality of them, so that they're not just rendered, but they're kind of hyper real and made up, you know. So you kind of look at it very closely and it becomes very like gross and physical, and then zoom out again. So you kind of start making the connection between these two kind of like realities. It feels too much like a little bit, it's the layers are turned on and off, and panels are removed. It's not that kind of a thing, I think, you know.
Yeah, isn't it? I mean, with entropy, it's really matter going from one state to another. And it's like, I think the 3, that's why I asked about the 3 images. And I agree, like if stuff just disappears, I'd rather kind of see it in the in-between state, you know, like rust, that you know, eventually eats away the metal, and then it, you know, but it does it in a certain kind of way, right? Or things that disintegrate or weather. The matter is still there, it's just in a different, you know, shape or form. And I think that's really interesting. I think the last time we talked about, I was talking about glass, and the weird thing about glass, that it's actually a liquid, you know, and it's like, you know, old glass panes are thicker at the bottom than they are at the top, you know, by like a microscopic amount. I mean, there's just a lot to mine here with, you know, things that decay faster than other things that are really slow. I mean, I like the setup of your thesis very much, and I think it's really interesting. And so I'm just looking always for more ways to see that, and then see ultimately what is the payoff of it? What kind of changed environment do you make?
I'm really interested to see like Herwig, the model is like, I don't see it that well. And I think that there's some really interesting things. I don't know if you can zoom in so we can see the salt growing, but I wonder what other studies you can, have, could you mold some food and document that? Or could you grow some mung beans over a structure to kind of demonstrate the phases of going from one state to another? Because for me, the most interesting thing are the physical models. I love the premise, but I would maybe spend some time in the kitchen growing things or molding things and document as another way of communicating the idea, because I think it's super interesting. And all you need to do is go onto YouTube and YouTube some really weird like experiments, science experiments, but then interpret that from the point of view of this project.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm also wondering, like, looking back at the 3 images that you have at the bottom, mm-hmm. Because by now you have your design that is changing in images, but the context, it's not changing at all. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if that should change together with the design. So it might be that the context is actually a constructed context, is constructed by you in a way, mm-hmm. so that the two things kind of work together. So it's not anymore as a sort of a collage. You have like a rendering in front of like a background that is given as a picture of somewhere else. Oh, I heard the voice. But the two together, the context and the thing, they together build the project. And also your project really reminds me to the Richard Long Walk the Line. There was this guy that he just walked on the grass along like a line, and he changed, basically he stepped on the grass and the grass changed its shape. And that was a sort of like an act of art. And it really reminds me to your project, kind of like giving back to the nature, something like the decay goes back to the ground. Or maybe it's also working with like different, I don't know, times of the day, I don't know, shifting from like day to night, kind of giving more this idea of like the time that is passing and changing might help.
I wonder, and maybe this is, Jiayue and I have been talking about sort of what does it mean to kind of think through a building across geological time, and like not just about to the point of the building being completed, but like what happens to the extended and very long life of buildings. And I'm wondering how much, I mean, the context that was set up was Mono Lake. It's an environment that hasn't really changed so much in the past, I don't know, 100 years. And it's an environment that changes very, very slowly. I'm curious if we were to think, if Jiayue was to think about this over, let's say, 500 years, if it makes sense that the only consideration is about the building and the materials, or whether there is some degree of hypothesis around other changes to this environment that could take place, hypothetical, like human intervention changes, things that would potentially maybe within a sort of longer timeline level things. And what does that also do to the sort of thinking about the sort of long life of the building, moments when it's maintained versus moments when it's kind of left to fall apart. And I don't know whether, at least in our conversation, I'm not too certain whether or not that might take her project into a sort of direction that is would be, let's say, a little bit too difficult to control or to kind of maintain, especially with like 4 weeks left. But just kind of leave that out. See what everybody thinks. And
I mean, it's an interesting question. I think the project is super compelling, like everyone else, the setup. And I'm enjoying the fact that in the last project that the modes of that architecture is too slow for modes of cultural production, but it's too fast for for like geological time. So like the way that the time scales got skewed between the last project and this project are super interesting. But at the end of the day, it's a fiction that she's creating, right? So it's not a material science project. It's sort of fictionalizing change over time. And so I think your question, Matthew, has to be asked to her. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a little bit like what I think Lucy was saying to one of the first students who presented, sort of what's at stake, what's the narrative that you're constructing and through the thesis.
Well, I think for me, as I was setting this up, I was because of the mono lake, it changes very gradually over time, but it does have this in about hundreds years, the water level would rise up. That's why I'm thinking it as one element that could impact to the building construction, as well as this kind of a tufa tower in the background that will grow up and starting to show more and more. I think that's I did think that the environment would take place in some degree of the fictional project, but yeah.
I don't know if it's helpful at all, probably not, but your project makes me think both about kind of photographic documentation of bunkers and also Wes Anderson movies. Like the model makes me think of Isle of Dogs, and then some of the photographic montage makes me think about bunkers. And so it's in this kind of alternate reality, I think, that you're operating within. I don't know if that's helpful.
I was thinking of the films of the brothers Quay, which have a lot of either real, like time-lapse kind of organic stuff, or certainly a material and aesthetic of that. I was just kind of on the side looking up some of them as examples, because it seems a little sunny and happy in the rendering, in the sense of, there's a kind of freshness aesthetic to it all. And I don't know, maybe that's the way to go. Like it isn't, I don't know, I was thinking of shipwrecks also, because I think the site's perfect, and I think the place is, that's absolutely okay and great. I just want to see more of it, I guess. And maybe less how you got there. Mm-hmm. I mean, those earlier things are great, but it really depends on what you want to get out of your thesis and the discussion in September. I mean, in this way, I talk to my students a lot about the strategy and your ownership of the discussion, right? So in essence, you control the discussion by the images that you put up in front of us and the words. And you can curate that discussion, and you should feel powerful in that way. To be able to have a discussion that you wish to talk about. Ultimately, I think this is what you're all doing. And so when you show the past work, you open yourself up for comments like, oh, I like that one, better, or why didn't you do that? And if you're okay with that, then it's okay. But if you want to purposely not do that, then don't show it, would be my advice. And would be like, no, I did do a lot of work. You don't need to see how I got there. I'm a magician, and so you figure it out on your own, right? However, if you are the kind of person, or your argument is, you know what, I'm never really going to finish this, but I would love to just share my work through my journey. And it's fine if someone likes something that I did, you know, in June, and it's not that, and they're not like the last thing, and that's okay. I'm just going to kind of give a menu, right, in my short time that I have to present, and I'd like to have a discussion around that. I think each student has to really think about that within their own work, what to show, what not to show. And it's really dependent on each project. My own students, I have varying, it depends on who it is and what they're trying to do. I think that's important.
I wonder if you could show it as stills from a movie, like a kind of, so you present it as more of a story, or as Darin said, like a fiction. So maybe you only, the 3 images at the bottom are the only ones that you show in your final, and then you make some more, or you demonstrate through like symbols of, you could make a movie of decay. And the movie, I always talk about this movie Upstream Color, and the way that the edit cuts from very close biological squishy things to kind of far out. It's clever. So maybe you could demonstrate this idea without making your own, you know, salt crystallizations, but you kind of reference others and you create this fiction as if it's a story, not an architecture. Not that there's a difference between the two, in my opinion, but as an idea for presentation.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any last comments before we close up? Thank you, Jiayue. Thank you to Lucy and Darin and Herwig joining us. Yes, and thank you to all the students. This was great. Good. It's really great to see. 4 weeks.
4, not 6.
4 weeks.
Not 6 or 7.
Don't listen to me. Don't listen to me. Wishful thinking.
Congrats, everybody. We get to work. Nice job.
Good to see you all.
I want to thank all our reviewers. Thanks, you guys. I thought you were really on your A games today. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
Ciao.
Bye.